Barron Trump enters the opulent New York charity gala alongside his mother Melania, who glides through the crowd in an exquisite midnight blue gown that captures everyone's attention. As guest of honor, she takes the stage to speak about children's education and humanitarian efforts, the chandeliers casting a golden glow across the assembled elite. Just as she concludes her heartfelt address, liberal journalist John Hall rises from the crowd, microphone poised like a weapon. "Mrs. Trump, how does it feel to be complicit in your husband's agenda?" he asks with biting contempt, his words deliberately loud enough to create an uncomfortable silence throughout the ballroom. What happens next not only leaves the gathered media stunned, but reveals a side of the youngest Trump that no one saw coming. Before we dive into this powerful story, tell us where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring content. The New York Charity Gala's opulent ballroom sparkled under dazzling chandeliers as society's elite mingled, champagne glasses clinking amid discussions of the latest headlines. Philanthropists and media personalities drifted between tables draped in silver and blue, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Tonight's guest of honor, Melania Trump, glided through the crowd in an exquisite midnight blue gown that seemed to capture the essence of the evening sky. Despite the swirling controversies that constantly surrounded her husband, Melania had maintained her signature poise, deliberately focusing her energy on humanitarian efforts and children's education causes that transcended the political chaos. As she ascended the stage, the crowd fell silent, captivated by her quiet assurance as she began her address, her Slovenian accent lending an elegant quality to each carefully chosen word. Just as she was concluding her thoughtful speech, a voice cut through the air with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "Mrs. Trump, how does it feel to be complicit in your husband's agenda?" The question dripped with barely concealed contempt. John Hall, an impeccably dressed journalist known for his liberal viewpoints, stood near the front, microphone positioned like a weapon, his reputation for sharp critiques of conservatives under the veneer of journalistic objectivity preceded him. A hushed stillness swept through the assembled guests as they exchanged knowing glances. This wasn't going to be a routine Q&A. Melania's lips parted slightly, but before she could formulate a response, Hall pressed forward, his voice gaining confidence as all eyes locked onto him. "Your husband has been accused of dividing the nation, of inciting hatred," he continued, words filling the space. "And yet you stand here portraying yourself as a role model. Don't you think the true role models are the ones resisting him?" The tension thickened as a few journalists smirked, sensing a viral moment in the making. But before Melania could respond, another voice broke through the charged silence, strong, resolute, and unexpectedly powerful. "That's enough." Every head in the room turned as Barron Trump stepped forward from the audience. No longer the reserved boy America had watched growing up in the White House, the now 17-year-old carried himself with the natural confidence of someone who had matured under intense public scrutiny. Tall and poised, he moved past the tables without hesitation, stepping onto the stage to position himself between his mother and the reporter. His mere presence altered the energy in the room. "Excuse me," he addressed Hall directly, his voice steady and composed. "You can ask tough questions, but this isn't journalism. This is harassment." A murmur spread through the crowd as Hall, momentarily caught off guard, let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Oh, and I suppose the president's son is about to give me a lecture on media ethics?" he retorted, attempting to regain control of the moment. Barron tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked onto Hall's with unwavering focus. "No," he responded smoothly. "I'm going to show you what respect looks like." The tension escalated from a subtle undercurrent to an overwhelming force. All attention fixed on Barron, and Hall found himself processing what had just happened. He had expected nervousness, hesitation, perhaps a moment of uncertainty he could transform into a viral soundbite. What he hadn't anticipated was Barron Trump, standing his ground with such composed determination. The smirk on Hall's face faltered momentarily before he quickly recovered. "Respect?" he repeated, his tone thick with sarcasm. "Forgive me, Barron, but I don't think you or your family are in any position to lecture the press on respect." A few uncertain chuckles rippled through the audience, but many remained motionless, watching this unexpected confrontation unfold. Barron stood firm, shoulders squared, his voice unwavering yet measured. "You can ask whatever questions you want," he said, "but what you just did, that wasn't a question. You tried to embarrass my mother." Hall's expression wavered, though he refused to yield ground. Mrs. Trump is a public figure, he replied defensively. She should expect tough questions. Barron took a deliberate step forward, his height forcing Hall to look up at him. Then why didn't you ask about her work tonight? About the children she's helping? The crowd shifted uncomfortably. It was a straightforward question, but it cut deep. Hall had no real answer, and everyone knew it. His job wasn't to highlight Melania's contributions. It was to turn her into a political target. Before Hall could regain his footing, Barron pressed forward. His words measured yet impactful. You came here for one reason, to make headlines. You didn't care about the purpose of this event. You wanted a viral clip, something to post on Twitter to rack up a few thousand likes from people who already agree with you. The room went silent. Guests exchanged glances, realizing that Barron wasn't just reacting. He was controlling this moment with a level of poise that belied his years. Hall's confidence visibly wavered as he glanced at the other journalists in the room, searching for support, but none came. They weren't accustomed to being challenged like this, especially not by a Trump, and certainly not by a 17-year-old. Melania, who had remained quietly behind her son, gently rested her hand on his arm. She didn't speak, but her expression conveyed everything: pride, resilience, and an unspoken message: I'm right here with you. Recognizing he was rapidly losing ground, Hall attempted to regain control. He forced a smirk and crossed his arms. You're young, Barron, he said, shaking his head condescendingly. You don't understand how this works. Barron didn't even blink. I know exactly how this works, he responded smoothly. I've watched people like you go after my family since I was a kid. His words landed with precision. As the journalist's smirk disappeared entirely, Barron stepped forward again, his voice unwavering. I just never imagined you'd be desperate enough to target a woman who's done nothing but try to help others. A wave of whispers spread through the crowd. Someone in the back even let out a quiet gasp of surprise. Even those journalists who had expected another routine takedown of a Trump found themselves momentarily stunned into silence. Hall's face flushed slightly. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Barron's right, announced a man in a well-tailored suit who stood near one of the round tables. Silver-haired, with the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to commanding attention. He locked eyes with Hall. This is a charity event. This isn't the place for petty political ambushes. More murmurs rippled through the room as heads nodded in agreement. For the first time that evening, John Hall looked genuinely unsure of himself. His carefully orchestrated moment was slipping away, and Barron Trump was far from finished. The silence in the ballroom grew thick with anticipation. Every gaze fixed on Barron. No one had ever seen a Trump challenge the media quite like this, not with anger or distraction, but with cold, deliberate precision. He wasn't lashing out, he was dismantling Hall piece by piece, with the calm calculation of someone twice his age. Hall clenched his jaw, recognizing he was losing control. He had arrived expecting to bait the young Trump into an awkward mistake, a headline-worthy blunder. Instead, he had walked straight into a storm. He hadn't anticipated Barron Trump standing his ground with the poise of a seasoned statesman. Desperate to regain footing, Hall forced out a chuckle, shaking his head as if Barron were nothing more than an inexperienced teenager. You know, Barron, he said, it's easy to defend your family when you've been raised in a tower of privilege. But out here in the real world, people like me have to ask the difficult questions. That's what journalism is. A few familiar faces in the crowd instinctively nodded, but something felt off. The usual rhythm of media attacks wasn't landing tonight. Hall's words sounded strained, almost desperate. Barron tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth hinting at the faintest smirk. He had him cornered. Oh, you mean the real world where my mother is dedicating her time to charity while you're here trying to make a headline by humiliating her? Hall's expression darkened as Barron stepped forward, his voice remaining steady but commanding complete attention. You want to talk about the real world? Fine. Barron gestured toward the audience. How many people here came tonight to support children? To talk about education and giving back? A considerable number of hands went up, while others nodded in agreement. Even those who weren't Trump supporters hadn't come. For a political battle, they were here for the cause. Barron turned back to Hall. And how many of you showed up to watch him turn this into a spectacle about himself? The crowd stirred as quiet laughter spread across the room. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. Hall was no longer steering the moment he had become a passenger in a vehicle. Barron was now controlling with masterful precision. Hall started to speak, but Barron cut in smoothly. "No, really," Barron said, pausing as if genuinely awaiting an answer. "Because from where I stand, the only person who thought this was about politics was you." Scattered applause broke out, not merely polite, but approving. Barron crossed his arms, locking eyes with Hall like a chess master who had just called checkmate. "You came here hoping to humiliate my mother," he said with quiet intensity. "Instead, you humiliated yourself." The room erupted in response. Even those who weren't Trump supporters recognized what had just transpired. Barron had done something remarkable. He had outmaneuvered the media at their own game, and he had done it without raising his voice or losing his composure. Hall's face flushed with frustration. He opened his mouth to respond, but the moment had already slipped away. His self-assurance and cockiness had vanished, replaced by the unmistakable look of a man who knew he had been outplayed. Then, to seal his victory, Barron leaned in slightly and delivered the final blow with effortless composure. "Next time, if you want to go after a Trump, maybe pick on someone your own size." The ballroom erupted in applause as Hall went rigid, searching for a retort that wouldn't come. He had played his game, and tonight he had lost completely. As Barron turned back toward his mother, who stood poised and unwavering, one thing was undeniable to everyone in the room. The youngest Trump had just left his mark. The applause continued echoing when Hall finally grasped just how badly the tables had turned. His once confident expression had disappeared, replaced by a strained artificial smile that barely masked his struggle to maintain composure while everything collapsed around him. Barron stood tall, his posture strong and assured. Hall was no longer the hunter he had become the hunted, and everyone in the room recognized it. Not ready to concede, Hall adjusted his tie and forced another chuckle. "So that's it?" he asked, attempting to sound unfazed, though the edge in his voice had disappeared. "You're saying I can't ask questions? Because it might make your family uncomfortable?" Barron's expression remained steady, his voice calm and measured. "You didn't ask a question. You made an accusation." A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd. Even those who weren't Trump supporters couldn't deny the truth in Barron's words. Hall's jaw tightened as his eyes flickered toward the other journalists, silently searching for support that never came. Barron stepped forward once more, not with aggression but with purpose. "You tried to paint my mother as the villain," he continued, "but you failed because the truth is she's here contributing, making a real impact." He gestured toward the charity banners draped behind the stage, showcasing the faces of children and families aided by Hall's foundation. "And what about you? What are you actually bringing to this event besides negativity?" Hall's face darkened to a deeper shade of red. His confidence completely crumbled. For the first time, he appeared genuinely uncomfortable as the audience shifted against him, some even shaking their heads in disapproval. He swallowed hard. "I was just doing my job," he muttered weakly. Barron smiled faintly. "Then maybe," he said, "you should try doing it better." The crowd erupted again, this time with deafening approval. Hall had entered expecting to take control of the room, to twist the night into his own spectacle. Instead, he had become the spectacle, completely dismantled by the youngest Trump in front of the elite media establishment. Melania, who had been quietly observing, smiled softly with unmistakable pride. There was no need for words. Her son had already said everything that mattered. Recognizing there was no salvaging the situation, Hall slowly lowered his microphone and turned away. His walk of shame had begun, and Barron Trump simply turned back to his mother, standing firmly by her side. Tonight, he wasn't just defending her, he was proving that the next generation of Trumps was ready to make its mark. As Hall made his exit, the cameras captured every step. He had walked into this ballroom expecting to make headlines. Instead, he had become one, and the entire world would be watching. Meanwhile, Melania reached out and adjusted her son's suit jacket, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. Barron smirked slightly, offering her a small nod before turning back to face the room. The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation, not just for Melania, not just for Barron, but for the undeniable shift that had just occurred. For years, people had dismissed him as merely the youngest Trump, a figure in the background. But after tonight, no one would ever underestimate Barron Trump again.